This has actually been a issue I've had to look into and really do a deep dive on over the course of the last 6 months. The concept of China and the United States being in a so-called second Cold War has become quite popular. There's stories about it almost every day. People are commenting on it. I personally believe that is entirely off base, and I'll explain why in a second. But the idea simply is that the United States and China is now the United States and the Soviet Union back in the 1980s, or even from the 1950s to the 1980s. That Cold War period was an ideological battle, an ideological war between communism and capitalism. The entire world was split into two. You had those that aligned with the United States and those that aligned with the Soviet Union. And I understand why this comparison would be made. But if you take a deeper step back, my concern actually is this is not a Cold War 2.0. What this is the preamble to a possible Great War 2.0. And by Great War, I'm referring to World War I back at the turn of the 20th century. And I've been fascinated, if you will, at looking at periods of time where different countries that have been sort of supreme or the hegemon or whatever you want to call it. And if you look back at the turn of the 20th century, the United Kingdom, the empire in which the sun did not set, was the hegemon of its time. And you had Germany that had just basically become a country itself, rising. And what I find fascinating in it was rising through manufacturing. It was rising through a host of economic changes that were ongoing, and it was proving to be a challenge to the United Kingdom. But what people tend not, I think, to appreciate a lot of times is if you do go back and you look at history, you'll find that the Germans fully recognized that the United Kingdom was, the number one global supreme power, and there was no desire by the Germans at the time, we're talking 1902 to 1904 or thereabouts, to challenge the United Kingdom. It was in nobody's best interest, anybody's. But they tried to work alongside the United Kingdom for a host of different issues. The best example that I give to everyone is there was a railway system from Berlin in Germany all the way down to Baghdad in Iraq, modern day Iraq. I think it's important to just make mention that the period of time in which I'm talking about was the very beginning of the petroleum, the oil boom, where countries like the United Kingdom were moving away from coal as a power source to petroleum. And the Germans wanted to build this railroad, and they went to the Brits and said, look, we'd like to work alongside you and put this together, joint venture, what have you. And the British delayed, and they were very diplomatically nice, but it was very clear that the British were concerned about the rise of Germany and were trying to contain Germany. They were looking at ways of putting tariffs on Germany, which is very similar to what we're seeing in today's world. And, that containment policy ultimately did not work. And you began to see the British try to play the French off the Russians. And again, I highly encourage everybody to look at the history of this sort of early 20th century period of time between the United Kingdom and the Germans. We look today, and I try to express to everybody that exactly the elements that were at play at that point in time are almost exactly what we see today between the United States and China. China has, contrary to what I think most people have viewed, has tried to operate within the so-called rule-based order with the United States. The United States has demanded that China do that, but interestingly enough, if you look at something like the IMF or the World Bank, China's been trying to work with the Americans to say, hey, we're now the world's second largest economy. We should have more power, more voting power in the IMF and the World Bank as opposed to China or Japan or Germany or elsewhere. And the United States has all along said, yes, yes, we agree, but has not moved on this. It's been 10 years now. So, you look at things like export controls. People like to talk about how China put export controls on rare earths. Well, this is referred to now as the weaponization of trade. You could make the argument that the weaponization of trade was actually first initiated through the United States under the Biden administration through the so-called small garden, high fence policy regarding access to technology. My point in all of this is, as I said, Great War 2.0, but the preamble, meaning what we're seeing right now between the Chinese and the Americans doesn't need to move into anything more kinetic. What I have been trying to express, and what I think is ridiculously important at this point in time, is number one, is to try and recognize, A, this is not Cold War. This is something that could potentially be much more worrisome. And having people be able to go back to the history books, be able to go back to look at how the world was evolving 120 odd years ago, step number one. I implore everybody to try to do that. Number two, I think it's important that both the Chinese and the Americans are able to find some degree of middle ground. I've talked in other videos about how the trade war is ongoing, that any time that America and China are speaking is fantastic. We need more of that conversation. Whether it's at low level, medium, or high level, or by Xi Jinping and Donald Trump himself. Conversation, dialogue, keep it going on. And again, this is not just about this is about both sides. China has demonstrated itself that, there are certain situations where there's an opportunity to speak and China does not participate. So that would be the sort of second part. And I think the third issue that I think is super important is for both of these great powers to fundamentally respect each other, to be able to recognize we may not agree on everything, and that's okay. Nobody agrees on anything. It's like a marriage, as it were. But if you can find where the common ground is, and I think what's critical is, as somebody who's lived in China for 30 years, I feel confident in saying the following. There is far more in common between China and the United States than there is difference. And because we live in a world that is very factious, it's easier to just find what separates us. Move in the direction where we look to see where there's commonality. And if we can do these elements, we can move things forward, I think the world will be a much safer place. We need only look around at what has transpired over the course of the last 6, 12, 18 months. And it's concerning. It's concerning to me. And all I'm looking to do is highlight this, what I consider to be woefully incomplete analysis of the manner in which China and the United States are being looked at as geopolitical rivals, the Cold War 2.0 trope, and recognizing that it is potentially much more worrisome. Everybody who has an understanding of China, everybody who is looking at the bilateral relationship, anywhere there can be dialogue, create the dialogue. And whenever there is dialogue, attempt as best as you can to be able to listen, to hear other different points of view, not take them as attacks, to listen intently, to try and be open to those ideas. This is how we will move forward in creating a more collaborative and, quite frankly, peaceful world.